putting together research to write the book. So it's quite an interesting family. Just so you guys understand, you know, I'm not a New York Giants fan. I'm a San Francisco Giants fan because I'm a Bay Area native. I was born in 1958 in the Bay Area. My parents were both Oakland Oaks fans when they grew up in Oakland. But by the 50s, the Oakland Oaks were no more, and the Giants, as you well know, came to San Francisco, and so they were big Giants fans. So I grew up as a Giants fan and cannot remember when, you know, I wasn't a Giants fan. I was just steeped in it, the radio always on, and had been a Giants fan for my entire life. So I know well the basic outlines of the Horace Stoneham story and the Giants franchise story. But it was actually Rob Garrett, who I think maybe is on the call today. It was Rob who suggested to me when he was doing all of his research on his books that I should take the opportunity and write the biography of Horace Stoneham, and I couldn't think of a reason why not, and so I did. It took me about 4 to 5 years of research and writing to finally complete the book, but I'm very excited about it. It's going to be a worthy book. Stoneham is a huge figure in the history of baseball. He's one of the most impactful franchise owners, and yet his biography has never been written until now. A book-length treatment of Stoneham did not exist until now. So it's a necessary. It fills a need in baseball history to know the complete story of Horace Stoneham. So I'm delighted to be here with you guys today. I know this group isn't shy about speaking up, and so I'm positive we'll have a very lively Q&A and general discussion. But before we get to that, I would like to take the opportunity of basically just relating several of the major episodes that will appear in the book and are about Stoneham and his experience with the Giants in New York. I'm going to talk about his father and how his father came to purchase the Giants, how Horace came to work for his father with the Giants. And then we'll talk about Stoneham's first major strategic decision as owner, which was to hire a new manager in 1941, which he did, and hired Mel Ott. And then we'll also talk about his next big managerial hire, which came in 1948, which was the shocking decision to hire Leo DeRocher to manage the Giants. We'll talk about the hot shot heard around the world. We'll talk about the catch, and we'll talk about the economic circumstances that came into being in the 1950s that forced Stoneham to come to the decision which he hated to make, which was to move the Giants out of New York to San Francisco. So if that works for you, Gary, that's what I'll cover, and then we'll open it up to
that sounds good.
Q&A.
You have a very good cast of characters here who definitely will not be afraid to voice their opinion and ask you questions. So it's all yours, Steve. Again, thank you for joining us.
Awesome. So let's first talk about Horace's father, and I'm not going to steal much of Rob's thunder here because boy, Charles Stoneham is a very, very fascinating and complicated character in his own right. Horace Charles Stoneham was the only surviving son of Charles Abraham Stoneham. Well, the only surviving son that we know of, because Charles had probably some other children outside of his primary marriage, but we won't get into that. He was a fascinating character. He was born in Jersey City in 1876, never finished high school, was a self-made millionaire in the way that you could become in those days. He worked in the securities business, in the stock trading business. He was almost certainly crooked. He ran what would be called a bucket shop, which took trading orders but didn't execute them immediately, instead waited for fluctuations in the market price of the stock to skim money off the top of all the deals. That was not illegal at the time, but was certainly considered shady. And Stoneham's reputation as a shady operator was very prominent. He was a big gambler. He was a close friend and associate of Arnold Rothstein. They were both big men about town in New York and in Saratoga. They owned racehorses and gambled a lot. So Charles Stoneham was a very, very rich guy. In the 19aughts and securities trading was basically the Silicon Valley of its day, and there were huge fortunes to be made, and Stoneham made one. He would think nothing of spending $70,000 in an evening's gambling. He was that rich. In the 19-teens, he was that rich. We don't know when Charles Stoneham first met John McGraw. It seems nearly certain that they knew each other quite well before 1918, because not just baseball, but they ran in the same circles. They loved gambling and liquor and horses in Havana, and they almost certainly knew each other before 1918. But we know that in 1918, the Giants owner Harry Hempstead decided to sell the franchise, and told John McGraw that that's what he was planning to do. And McGraw, of course, was the most important employee of the enterprise, and McGraw was thinking at that point about maybe perhaps becoming an owner himself. He didn't have the money to purchase the franchise outright, but he wanted to partner with somebody who he could work with as a minority owner. And so a Tammany Hall judge by the name of Francis McQuaid, who was almost certainly of less than building himself, as judges in Tammany Hall were in those days, he was the character who actually brokered the deal, who got McGraw and Stoneham together and made sure that they negotiated a deal. They negotiated a deal in December 1918 and January of 1919. Stoneham became the managing owner. He purchased 58% of the stock. And McGraw and McQuaid both became minority share owners with the purchase. McQuaid became the secretary, as it was known in those days, basically the business manager of the operation. McGraw, as a minority owner, was of course the manager, and also served in the capacity that we normally call today the general manager. He ran the baseball operation, and Horace Stoneham, or Charles Stoneham rather, supplied the money. Charles Stoneham wasn't just, however, the money behind the operation. He was a big, huge baseball fan himself. He'd grown up a Giants fan in Jersey City, and was delighted, thrilled with the opportunity to buy the Giants. His teenage son Horace, of course, was a huge Giants fan, and the story is told that when the deal was finalized and Charles Stoneham became the actual owner of the franchise, he came home and told Horace Stoneham, "Horry, I've just bought you a ball club." And he wasn't just speaking facetiously there. What he intended was that in time his son would inherit the team and become the owner of the Giants. Charles Stoneham, was a shady operator and knew that his social capital was limited. So buying into the Giants was his way of becoming legit, of getting out of the shady bucket shop business and becoming a genuine member of the New York sporting society. And it was his wish that this way he would allow his son Horace to become a legitimate businessman himself and not have to be a shady securities operator, and could just own the franchise. And so it was a dream come true for Charles, and certainly for young Horace himself when that deal was finalized. Horace was just in high school at the time, but then a couple of years later he graduated from high school. And before taking over ownership of the Giants, it was Charles's wish that Horace would get a college education. Charles himself never had a college education and felt that was something missing in his background and his expertise. And so he sent Horace Stoneham off to Fordham. Horace loved to tell the story that he lasted at Fordham about 4 days. That's probably an exaggeration for the sake of a good story, but it is the case that Horace did drop out of Fordham in his freshman year, much to his father's frustration. And his father kept trying to convince young Horace to go back to college and get a college education, and Horace refused to do it. And the father and the son were locked in the kind of disagreement that fathers and sons have often been locked in over the centuries. Finally, in frustration, Charles came up with an idea of a way to educate his young son and harden him up and have him learn some hard lessons about life. If college wasn't going to do it, then he had a better plan. Among Charles's many business stakes that he had, he owned a copper mine. He owned several, in fact, but he owned one copper mine in particular in the town of Copperopolis, California, which is in the Calaveras County, which is in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. It's a very rough, remote place. As far away from the cushy Manhattan life that young Horace was leading as could possibly be arranged. And that was the idea. It was a way to toughen young Horace up, to get him to learn hard work and responsibility, and maybe take some of his attitude off of him. So Horace bound a train in 1923 and went off to Copperopolis and spent, we don't know exactly how long, but it seems to be at least 1 year at this copper mine in Copperopolis. And it was reform school. It was to toughen the spoiled brat up, and by all accounts, it worked. Horace did learn humility. He learned to respect hard work and the people who do it. And he performed. We don't know exactly what he did there. It seems unlikely that he actually worked in the mines of the smelters. He probably worked in the office managing the business of the mine, but he did well. He showed up to work. He performed his responsibilities, and he basically passed the test that his father had set for him. So in the spring of 1924, in March of 1924, Charles Stoneham sent a telegram to Horace and said, okay, your penance in Copperopolis is over, and board a train for Sarasota, Florida, and you're going to join the Giants there in spring training of 1924. And so from 1924 forward, Horace worked for his father, working for the Giants. The work that his father set him up to do, and once again, his father put him to work. Horace wasn't just given an empty title, and a meaningless job. He was responsible for actual work. His father wanted to make sure he learned the whole business from the bottom up. He started actually in the ticket office at the Polo Grounds, learning how the ticket office sold tickets and managed the receipts, and from there he learned the other operations of the Polo Grounds stadium itself, the managing the actual field and the stadium and all of the operations around that. Understand that in the 1920s, the Polo Grounds wasn't just the Giants' home park. It was a year-round sports and entertainment venue that provided substantial income to the Stoneham family. And over the period of years, it was Horace who learned from Eddie Brannick, who was his mentor. He learned to basically run the entire Polo Grounds operation year-round. And by the late 1920s, that was his responsibility. He was running the Polo Grounds. The Polo Grounds was the home not just of baseball, but of boxing. Many of the greatest boxing matches of the period were held at the Polo Grounds. College football, which at that time was a bigger deal than pro football. Many of the great college football games of the time were held at the Polo Grounds. New Brockney and Red Grange and all those characters played at the Polo Grounds. And pro football, which was just sort of a nascent enterprise. The New York Football Giants played their games at the Polo Grounds, and Horace Stoneham was the guy who was managing all that. Yes, was there a question?
I think you just heard background noise.
Never got their TV on. I don't. I'm gonna have to mute everybody. Come on.
Please mute your microphone if you can. Okay, so I'll continue. Let's turn our attention then to Horace's first. Horace inherited the Giants in 1936 when his father, at the age of 59, died of kidney disease, and Horace, at the age of 32, became one of the youngest owners in the history of Major League Baseball. And at that time, of course, Bill Terry was the playing manager of the Giants, and still at that point in the 1930s, only a couple of teams had hired what we would now call general managers. There was Branch Rickey in St. Louis. There was Ed Barrow with the Yankees in New York, but that was about it. For most teams, including the Giants, the field manager was the general manager. He not only made up the lineup and called for the bunts, he made the trades and negotiated the contracts and decided who got cut down and called up and managed the entire roster. Well, that was what Bill Terry did with the Giants. And Bill Terry, although he liked Horace well enough, he certainly wasn't going to be taking much direction from young Horace. It was Bill Terry's operation in the same way that it had been John McGraw's operation. and Horace was still, you know, the owner and paying the bills, but not running the operation. This worked for several years, but by the early 1940s, the Giants were starting to struggle for the first time in the Stoneham ownership. They were no longer contending for the pennant in the National League, and now, infuriatingly, the Brooklyn Dodgers were. The Brooklyn Dodgers, who were, you know, for the longest time a laughing stock, and also ran nothing to be taken seriously. They were now not only better than the Giants on the field, they were outdrawing the Giants at Ebbets Field. And so things weren't going well. And Bill Terry was frustrated and decided that this way he was doing it wasn't working anymore. And so he came to Horace in the fall of 1941 and said, look, I want to resign as field manager and become the full-time general manager. Horace took a couple of months to consider that, but then in December he agreed with that decision, and then their mutual decision between Stoneham was to decide who to hire as the new field manager to replace Bill Terry. And they considered a number of names. They considered Gabby Hartnett, they considered Dick Bartell, they considered Billy Georges. The name they finally decided on was Mel Ott, who of course was the Giants' star player and team captain, but not the type of personality that one normally associates with managers. He was very shy, he was very quiet, he was very reticent, he was not a gung-ho leader type, yet this was the decision that they came to. We don't know whose idea it was, but it seems likely that it was Horace's idea, and Terry went along with it. So they're at the winter meetings in December of 1941 in Jacksonville, Florida, when between the two of them, come up with this decision. And so they go to get on the telephone to call Mel Ott back at his home in Louisiana to give him the great news. However, unbeknownst to them, Mel Ott was not at home. His wife answered the phone and told them that Mel is not at home. Mel is, in fact, in Jacksonville, Florida. Unbeknownst to them, Mel had gone to Jacksonville. He often would go to these winter meetings just as a social break in the off season, but this time he had a purpose. He went there. He was worried, as well as Terry was. He was worried about how the team was going, and he was worried that he was going to get a pay cut. And so he went there to make his argument that he didn't deserve a pay cut, and he was going to go into Horace and to Bill and to tell him, by golly, I don't deserve a pay cut. That's why he was in Jacksonville. Well, that was a surprise to Stoneham and Terry, but they sent out a messenger, and somebody found Mel Ott eating lunch at a restaurant down the street from the hotel where Stoneham and Terry were, and they fetched him and they brought him in, and Horace gives him the great news that, guess what? Not only are you not getting a pay cut, you're getting a promotion and a pay raise, and you're going to be my new manager. Nobody was more surprised than Mel Ott himself. The last person he expected to be named manager was Mel Ott. But once he got over his shock, and both Terry and Stoneham assured him, this is a good thing, you should say yes. He said yes, and he called home to Mildred and gave her the great news. As for Stoneham himself, his first call was not to the press to announce it formally. His first call was to Toots Shore, his great buddy back in New York, running Toots Shore's restaurant. Stoneham announced to Toots Shore that my new manager is Mel Ott, and Toots in turn announced it to the whole barroom there that the new manager is Mel Ott, and of course everybody was stunned, surprised, but delighted. Everybody who knew Mel Ott loved Mel Ott, and everybody was excited and thrilled about this turn of events that nobody had seen coming. Then Stoneham did assemble the press for a press conference and formally announce it. The press was skeptical that Mel truly would be his own man. They thought this was more of a figurehead thing, and that Bill Terry would still actually be running things. But Terry and Stoneham assured them, no, Mel's going to be his own man. He's going to run the team on the field, and Terry will be the full-time general manager, focusing on the farm system, which of course in those days was really just beginning to be developed and was really requiring full-time supervision in a way that it never had before. So with his first strategic decision, Stoneham pulled a very surprising one that nobody had expected. And it's not clear how much sort of hard-headed analysis had gone into it. Exactly whether it would be a good decision or not is debatable. Mel's performance as manager, while not disastrous, was not impressive to very many people either. But nonetheless, it was done, and Ott was the manager of the Giants for the next several years throughout the entire war and into the post-war era, into 1948. But in mid-1948, the Giants were struggling. And across town in Brooklyn, for the first time in many years, the Dodgers were struggling as well. And Leo DeRocher, who had been the superstar manager of the Dodgers since 1937, I guess it was, every season except 1947, when DeRocher was under suspension from the league for consorting with gamblers, every season other than that, DeRocher had been the superstar manager under Branch Rickey now of the Dodgers. Rickey loved DeRocher. They'd known each other since Rickey's days back in St. Louis, but he sensed in '48 that DeRocher's, he wasn't at the top of his game, and the Dodgers were struggling, and fans were booing for the first time ever, and Rickey had come to the decision that he had to let DeRocher go. But Rickey, for all of his many strong points as a decision maker and a personality, he was a very gentle personality, and he didn't like to give bad news to people, especially people he liked, such as DeRocher, and he couldn't bring it to himself to sit down with DeRocher and give him the bad news. So he sent, his emissary, Harold Parrott, down to tell DeRocher. And of course, DeRocher said, well, I'm not going to resign. The old man's got to tell me himself. I'm not going to do it. And so DeRocher then goes to the press and explains to the press what's going on. So now DeRocher has sort of leaked the whole story, and Rickey is in a bind, and he's either going to have to actually fire DeRocher himself or be made to look quite foolish by DeRocher. And of course, this was all in the newspaper of anybody who could read a newspaper, which included Horace Stoneham and included Mel Ott, knew that DeRocher's time with the Dodgers was probably very short-lived. So it was under these circumstances that Stoneham came to the sad decision that his own manager, Mel Ott, who he adored, probably more than anybody else in the organization, Stoneham just loved Mel Ott, that he was going to have to give Ott the bad news. And he decided, Stoneham did, that the guy he wanted to replace Ott was none other than DeRocher. And so Stoneham contacted the league president and asked for permission to speak to Rickey about DeRocher, and Rick grants it, and so Stoneham calls Rickey. Now, you will often hear a version of this story is that Stoneham called Rickey and asked for permission to talk to not DeRocher, but to Bert Schotten, who had been the interim manager in 1947 when Stoneham was on suspension. And Schotten was kind of one of Rickey's loyal lifetime employees, now retired as a scout back home in Florida. And so the story is that Stoneham wanted to talk to Rickey about Schotten's availability. And Rickey said, well, no, you can't have Schotten, but I'll let you talk to DeRocher. And surprised, Stoneham said, okay, fine, I'll talk to DeRocher. That's a story, but there's no basis in evidence that it's ever fact. Stoneham knew that DeRocher was at odds with Rickey, and Stoneham knew the story, and so Stoneham wanted DeRocher, and so that's who Rickey gave him permission to talk to, and Stoneham then called Rickey, or Stoneham then called DeRocher, and they made a deal, and DeRocher resigned as manager of the Dodgers and became manager of the Giants in July of 1948. It was the most shocking news imaginable. If Mel Ott's hire had been a surprise in 1941, this was far more surprising. Nobody expected this. Nobody was sure who was more stunned and bewildered by it. Giants fans who had just now hired their arch enemy, Leo DeRocher. There was no more hated figure in Giants land. They were stunned that he was now on their side. And Dodgers fans were equally stunned that their beloved DeRocher, their Leo the Lip, their guy, was now going to go manage the Giants. It was staggering. Yet that's what happened. And so in both of Stoneham's, two first big strategic decisions, he had stunned everyone. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the racial integration issue and Stoneham's part in that. As we all know, Rickey was the first to racially integrate Major League Baseball. Stoneham was not not the first pioneer, nor was he the second. The second was Bill Veeck with the Cleveland Indians. But, you know, by the end of 1948, once Robinson and Roy Campanella in the National League and Larry Doby and Satchel Paige in the American League, once they'd proven the concept successful, Stoneham was ready to move. And so in the winter of 1948 and 49, Stoneham acquired 3 Negro League players, 2 from the Kansas City Monarchs. From the Monarchs, he acquired 23-year-old infielder Hank Thompson, who had actually played briefly in the major leagues with the St. Louis Browns in 1947. He also acquired 30-year-old pitcher John Ford Smith, Speedball Smith, from the Monarchs. And from the Newark Eagles, Stoneham acquired 30-year-old outfielder Monty Irvin, who of course had been long believed before Robinson went to the Dodgers that everybody had thought that if there was going to be a first black player to play in the major leagues, it would be Irvin, who was not only a sensational player, but like Robinson, college educated, you know, well-spoken, articulate, and a very mature and a great personality, a solid person. So the Giants, though, got him in the winter of 1948-49. Please understand that Stoneham's motivation in this was not entirely altruistic. His first priority here wasn't to, you know, forward the standard of social progress. Stoneham was trying to compete for talent. As Chub Feeney would famously put it, of course we knew segregation was wrong. My uncle knew it and I knew it, but pure idealists we were not. Their motivation was to compete with the Dodgers and the Yankees and draw fans and win games. So that's why they went all in. Yet Stoneham went into integration in a more deeper and profound way than Rickey did, or Veeck did, or anybody else did. Because Stoneham not only acquired black players beginning in 1949, and you know by 1950 he was acquiring Willie May.
They take out any cake for you?
He also made a more profound acquisition.
It's almost over.
Let's recall that the Polo Grounds was the home field not only for the New York Giants but for the New York Cubans.
Sure you don't want me to take out the apple pie?
Please mute your mic if you can. The New York Cubans, the Negro League team that played in New York. The owner of that franchise was Alejandro Alex Pompez, a black Cuban who had extensive contacts not only in the Negro Leagues in the United States, but throughout Cuba and the Dominican in black baseball there. Stoneham and Pompez began to know each other through the New York Cubans, and by 1948-49, it's becoming clear that if racial integration is occurring in Major League Baseball, which it is, this is going to kill the Negro Leagues. And so Pompez knew that his future as an owner there was threatened. And Stoneham knew that if he was going to go into this racial integration thing in a successful way, boy, there'd be nobody better to help him do it than Alex Pompez. And so in 1949, the New York Cubans became not just a Negro League team, but a farm club of the Giants. They were formally affiliated with the Giants. And it was through Pompez's Cubans that the Giants quickly acquired Ray Dandridge. They acquired Rafael Ray Noble, the catcher, and they acquired a pitcher named Dave Barnhill. Only of those, only Noble would play with the Giants in the major leagues. But by 1951, this process was progressing, and it was clear that the Negro League future was dimming. And so in 1951, Stoneham hired Alex Pompez into his front office. Stoneham in 1951 became the first Major League Baseball team, and the first one for a long, long time, to hire a black executive into the front office. And Pompez would work for Stoneham for the rest of his life, for the next 20 years. Pompez was not only a great scout, and not only helped Stoneham get the best pipeline of talent to the Giants organization from the Caribbean, from the Dominican, from Cuba, from all of his African-American community network of people in the United States. You know, it was through Pompez the Giants got McCovey and Cepeda and Marichal, the Lou brothers, and Tony Taylor and Bill White and all the rest. And Pompez then was not only a scout, but he was also a mentor and a guide and a big brother and an uncle to the Black and Caribbean players in the Giants organization. He helped them out with their finances, with their English language, with learning how to manage in Jim Crow America and get around and buy you know, clothes and cars and managed bank accounts and all that stuff. Pompez was the guy who really assisted all these young Black and Latin men in a very tough environment in the 1950s and 60s in the United States. It was Pompez who made them be successful. And it was Pompez's association with Stoneham, which was quite unique. No other organization did such a thing. It's a remarkable story, and one that has been not very well told. Until now, one hopes. So there was a great book about this, by the way, that you may have seen by, oh gosh, now I'm going to whiff on his name.
Burgos, Adrian Burgos.
Yes, that book. A great biography of Alex Pompez that I highly recommend, and is one of my great sources for.
Steve,
Yeah.
can I ask you a quick question on the Cubans? And
Please
when
do.
you say they became a formal member of the Giant system,
Yep.
what was the legal situation? Did he have to register this with the National Association?
No, it was a little looser than that. The Negro Leagues were not part of organized baseball. They weren't affiliated with the National Association. They were outlaw in that sense. But it was a legal agreement between Stoneham and Pompez that Pompez's any player that Stoneham wanted from the Cubans, Pompez would provide to Stoneham. He didn't just give them away. He
Well, it was
would
also
take
part.
compensation.
He owed him rent, right, for the games.
Well, and yes, in fact, the deal was in lieu of rent, you're going to give me players. And that was effectively how it, or at least in lieu of full rent. He got a great discounted rent and provided Stoneham with players instead. And it was a very short time, but by the early 50s, the Negro Leagues were really starting to unravel, and the Cubans went completely belly up.
Lee, what was the name of that book?
It's Adrian Burgos. I have it. What's it called?
Cuban Star.
It's a biography of Alexander Pompez.
Yeah,
And
I should have it on my shelf
And
here, and
it's
of course I'm
called
not
Black
seeing it.
Eagle or something like that.
It's
I
a
think it's the
great book.
Cuban Star.
All right, yeah, great. That's it.
It's a
Thank
great
you.
book. And
Tremendous book.
Adrian's a wonderful historian and scholar. It's the best on the subject. Before I open it up to Q&A generally, I'd like just to mention three things quickly. First of all, the shot turned around the world, and then the catch. The early 50s were Stoneham's greatest period of success for the Giants in New York. They won the World Series in '54, and they won the pennant in '50. Where was Horace Stoneham for those two iconic moments? Horace Stoneham actually did not see Bobby Thompson hit his home run, because the Giants, of course, were trailing going into the bottom of the ninth inning there, and Stoneham, nervous pessimist that he was afraid they were going to lose and didn't want to see it, and so he went to the clubhouse to wait for the players to come in, and so he could personally, give them his own gratitude and thanks for the great season they'd had, even though they hadn't won the game. And so he only heard it on the radio. He heard Russ Hodges make the call from the clubhouse in the Polo Grounds when Bobby home run. Then in 1954, in the Polo Grounds, Game 1, Mays makes the iconic catch off Vic Wirtz. Where was Stoneham? You will often hear it said that Stoneham was watching that play from the clubhouse, which is where Stoneham actually often watched games, more frequently than sitting in the owner's box in the box seats in the Polo Grounds. Stoneham preferred to watch from the window of the clubhouse in center field. You'll often hear it said that that's Stoneham watching that catch. You can see a little bit of a blur of somebody looking out the window. That's Stoneham. No, that's actually not true, because this was not just any game. This was Game 1 of the World Series, and as the owner of the home team, Stoneham had an obligation to be a host. There would be big dignitaries there, the commissioner and other owners and famous celebrities. It's Game 1. So Stoneham was actually sitting in the owner's box at the Polo Grounds when that amazing play took place. Okay, before we open it up here, just to cover the issue of why the Giants had to move. It didn't seem so at the time. In 1954, the Giants were world champions, and then hit ticker tape parade in Wall Street, and everything looked great. But of course, peel back the the onion just a little bit, everything was not great for the Giants and for Major League Baseball in particular. In the post-war period, the United States changed quickly and dramatically in economic terms. And among the big, big changes that occurred was that more and more people could afford to own an automobile. And the automobile became the preferred means of transportation for a far greater number of people than had ever been before. Increasingly, people in cities like New York, where people did not own cars, they relied on public transportation, well, they could afford to buy a car now. And that meant that they could afford to move out of the inner city and move out to the suburbs of Long Island and Connecticut and New Jersey and commute into the city in their car. Well, this was great for them and great for growing suburban places, but it was not good for inner cities. It was not good for businesses that did their business in inner cities. It was not good for businesses like New York Giants and Major League Baseball. They were losing fans at an alarming rate, and these fans who were affluent and who were overwhelmingly white did not want to now commute back into the city where traffic was problematic and it was hard to get your car into the city. It was hard to find parking. These old stadiums did not have much parking. So it was inconvenient to go into places like Harlem to watch the Giants in the Polo Grounds, and the neighborhood was becoming, of course, very poor and very black and very scary to these white fans. And so it was a cycle that was repeating itself, not just in New York, but in Philadelphia, in Boston, in Cleveland, in Detroit, in Washington, D.C. Attendance was nosediving in the 50s, and it was plain to see that Major League Baseball, if it was going to address this, was going to have to move to where the fans were. And the fans were not in the inner cities. They were in the suburbs, and they were increasingly in newer cities that had grown up with the automobile and had been built out to accommodate the automobile. Cities like Minneapolis, St. Paul, Atlanta, Houston, Dallas, San Francisco, and Los Angeles was where Major League Baseball was going to have to go. You'll often hear the story that it was O'Malley's idea, and he convinced Stoneham. He sprung the idea on Stoneham that they should move to California together. While it seems to be the case that formerly O'Malley was the first to formally suggest it, but between the two, it wasn't the first time Stoneham had thought about it. That's just not true. Stoneham had been actively investigating and researching a number of cities, not just San Francisco. Minneapolis, St. Paul, of course, was his probably his first choice. He'd been actively working with the city there as the stadium was being constructed. He was probably going to move to Minneapolis, but he was also talking with people in Dallas and in Houston and in San Francisco. O'Malley wasn't the first guy who gave Stoneham this idea. And Stoneham, basically the character that Stoneham is presented at in that anecdote is that Stoneham was kind of a bumbler, kind of a useful idiot for O'Malley. That's just not factually correct. Stoneham was a sharp guy. He was intelligent. He was just as sharp as O'Malley. He understood the business proposition just as well as O'Malley did. And the deal that he could get in San Francisco was just so much better than anything New York could offer him, that it was a no-brainer to go, especially moving in tandem with the Dodgers. That way they could keep the rivalry alive in California. In fact, rekindle the rivalry. They would be each other's best box office draw when each played the other in their respective cities in California. It was just a natural. And moreover, Stoneham, he knew what was happening. If he didn't go to San Francisco, somebody else would. And he wanted to get there before somebody like, I don't know, the Cleveland Indians or the Boston Red Sox, the Washington Senators. There were the Cincinnati Reds. There were a number of teams at that time that were thinking about relocating. And Stoneham was afraid that if he didn't go to California with O'Malley, then somebody else would go to San Francisco and he'd be left out. But that was the motivation. He wasn't surprised or persuaded to do that. He was eager to do it. And he was an active partner with O'Malley in the decision to move to California. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to open it up to your questions.
Yeah, Steve, this is Stu in Minnesota, and it goes along kind of with the move too. And the story that gets told around here in Minnesota is that because the Giants owned land in St. Louis Park, a suburb to the west, that if the Giants had moved here when they did move, that they would have gone there. Of course, that's false because Met Stadium was built yet already, and it was a fine stadium for them. But going back to the Giants, after they purchased the Minneapolis Millers, bought that land in late 1948, and we're talking about building a new stadium for the Millers, perhaps in time for the 1950 season. It never got built. Another story that goes around here is that it was the Korean War and the National Production Act, although that doesn't make sense to me because there was over a year and a half or nearly 2 years that they hadn't started construction. And a few of us have looked at what happened. There was news in the paper of the Giants being very big on building a stadium, sort of like the Polo Grounds. It would seat about 18,000. If they had built it, what the Twin Cities might have gotten was another team, one of those that moved in the earlier 50s. But I don't know if this is the reason or not. They bought it from a cafe. They bought the land from a cafe across the highway at a reduced price. And apparently there was an agreement that the cafe had with the Giants, was that if they didn't build a stadium there in 5 years, that the cafe could buy the land back. And they were selling it at a discount because of the added business that would come. And eventually there was a lawsuit the cafe took against, by that time, the San Francisco Giants, and the cafe lost it. It wasn't in writing, I guess, but I never knew if there might have been a formal or an informal agreement, a handshake deal, and still never know why they never built there. If it had been Charles Stoneham, I would have thought a little bit more that maybe that was by design, just to get this land at a cheap price by promising to build a stadium with no intention to do so. They held on to the land until the 70s and sold it at a large profit. But so that's a little different, getting out of the New York area. But do you know anything about that, their ownership of the Millers and then the purchase of land to apparently build a stadium?
Well, bear in mind that for the longest time, the Giants made money from the baseball team, but also from the Polo Grounds. That had been a major secondary source of income to the National Exhibition Company, to the Stoneham family business. But by the 50s, that was less and less the case. All these boxing matches and college football games and everything, nobody wanted to hold those in the Polo Grounds anymore. So the Polo Grounds wasn't making money for the Giants as it had in the past in the 50s. So along with moving the franchise, what Stoneham was seeking out was other ancillary sources of income. And he was thinking about it in terms of real estate deals. And if he moved to Minneapolis, as you say, he wasn't going to build the ballpark. That was going to be publicly funded, but he was looking at ways to sort of have a side gig there with real estate, investments in and around the ballpark that would feature the Giants and that would be able to sort of leverage the Giants brand name as a way for him to make money in real estate. He invested small bits there and sort of dabbled in it, but never got very far along because he was putting irons in the fire. He was simultaneously to that, he was looking into investing in real estate in Arizona, in Casa Grande, Arizona specifically, which is where he finally chose to do. When he chose to go to San Francisco, he didn't purchase any real estate in the San Francisco Bay Area other than his house, but he purchased a huge plot of real estate in Casa Grande, Arizona to develop the Giants spring training complex there in Arizona as a means of making money year round, because it would not only be used for spring training, it would be a golf a vacation resort where he could make money off the golf course and the hotel throughout the first season in Arizona, which is basically all winter long, and then also sell lots for home development in Arizona. So that was his way of making money alongside the Giants that he eventually decided to do. But had he gone to Minneapolis, he would have probably tried to do something with real estate investments in the Minneapolis area. And Minneapolis, St. Paul at the time was booming, just like so many of these younger cities were. It was not a bad idea to try and make some money in real estate in Minneapolis in the 1950s and 60s.
Steve, you're talking about all these real estate deals, sort of off the track, but on something that deals directly with baseball. How in God's name did the Giants wind up in Candlestick Park, which turned out to be one of the most horrible places to play baseball for 40 years? How did that happen? The only story I know, I'm not as invested. I've been a New York Giants fan and a San Francisco Giants fan for about, I got to do the arithmetic. I'm 75 and I was 8 years old when I saw my first game. When my wife and I traveled to California in 1974 and we saw a couple of games at Candlestick in August, the weather around, that was the first time I'd been to California. The weather around was beautiful. And then we went to a night game at Candlestick Park in the middle of August. And we stopped at a Bank of America place to get some money. And I had my New York Giants gear on. I looked as crazy as ever. And the banker, I don't know who he was just a local vice president. He said Stoneham was shown Candlestick Point at 10 o'clock in the morning. And if he had gone there at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, it would have been a gale. So that's not evidence of anything other than it leads to my question. The evidence is 40 years they played in a wind tunnel. How does he wind up in that wind tunnel? How did the Giants wind up playing in Candlestick Park?
Okay, Steve. Great question. Thank you. You'll often hear that story that they took Stoneham out to look at the building site in the morning when it was nice and calm, and then ushered him away quickly before the afternoon wind came up. It's of course like so much of this stuff. It's phony. It's not true.
I could add
Stoneham was not the builder of Candlestick Park. Stoneham was the tenant. The ballpark was built by the city and county of San Francisco, and it was planned and the land was all acquired long before the Giants decided to move to San Francisco. You think Tammany Hall and New York politics were corrupt back in the day in New York? Well, so was San Francisco politics in the 1950s. The project to site the ballpark at Candlestick Point and to have the developer and the construction contractor to build it be Roy Harney was corrupt. Harney was a corrupt real estate developer who swindled the city into buying the terrible. There was a reason that land had never been developed in San Francisco, because it was the worst spot in the entire city and county. It was miserable weather, very difficult to gain access to, not scenic by any means. It was the worst possible site for a ballpark. But that allowed Harney to buy the land at pennies an acre and sell it back to the city at hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was a corrupt deal. Stoneham had no choice in the matter at all. Stoneham was promised was a brand new stadium up to modern spec with a huge parking lot, which he did not have in New York, and which he needed to be able to attract people from the big Bay Area to come drive to his ballpark and have parking. And so that's what he wanted, and that's what he got. And that was the only say he had in it. He didn't have any say in where the ballpark was built or how.
I don't want to argue with you because I don't know anything, but he did have a say. You just discussed that he was looking at Minneapolis, he was looking at Dallas, he was looking at a lot of cities, and he's looking to move into even if I'm just looking to buy a used car, I walk around the car, I kick the tires, I want to see how it runs. He's moving into a building where he's going to have his baseball team, which he treasures, is going to play baseball. I don't buy it. Maybe they're corrupt. I'm sure they are.
He had no say. It wasn't his call. He was not the owner of that property.
He could have moved to Minneapolis.
He could have, but he also recognized that the Bay Area was larger population than Minneapolis, St. Paul, far more affluent, and far faster growing. It was a better market. It was a better market for his team. It was a better market for his radio and TV.
Last question, and then I'm going to go back and shut up.
He wanted San Francisco for all it had to offer. He probably could have done a more diligent job of critiquing the choices that the city was making, but he had no say in it. It wasn't his call.
Did he know that in the afternoon, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, that became a wind tunnel?
He, like everybody else, had never been there before. Nobody in San Francisco anticipated just how badly that ballpark would play. The planners said that Candlestick Hill, the big hill that abuts the stadium there, would act as a windbreak. and that the wind would go around the stadium. Of course, it proved to be untrue. They didn't realize just how terrible that ballpark would be until it was built. Late.
Steve,
And they certainly weren't going to be able to replace it. They were stuck with it. And it
Steve?
became, of course, the
sorry.
millstone for the Giants, that it became one of the reasons why Stoneham was unable to successfully compete with the A's 10, 15 years later, is because Candlestick was just a terrible, terrible ball. It was everything you've heard about Candlestick, how bad it was, that's true. It was every bit that bad. It was a terrible ball.
Steve, the Giant Stoneham wanted a ballpark by the Whitestone Bridge, and he wanted one on the piers where the Jacob Javits was built. He was turned down by Robert Moses. In the book, The Power Broker, that explains it, but I've even read some information before that. O'Malley wanted a ballpark on the waterfront where the Barclays Center is now. Robert Moses also turned him down for that, but he offered him the Swamps of Shea Stadium for the Dodgers, and O'Malley turned that down. Now, as far as the Candlestick Park, he originally wanted a ballpark by the Moscone Center, but for that even, he wanted parking spaces across the street from Seal Stadium. That land was deeded for a city park, and Will said it was going to be used for anything else that would revert back to the landowners. So as far as Harney owned the garbage dump out there. Now, I was going to games in 1947 at the Polo Grounds. We lived in Inwood Hill Park. So pretty much, by the time the Giants moved, I already was hearing about all the things that Stoneham wanted for a ballpark on the where the Jacob Javits Convention Center is on the Hudson River. Turned down for that because they wanted to make more money with other endeavors back then. And by the Whitestone Bridge on the Bronx side, Stoneham also wanted a ballpark there. Again, it was turned down.
Two things about that. Your location for the Bronx one is wrong. It's actually where the Hutch and the New England Thruway would come together, where Bay Plaza, the mall sits, and where the amusement park Freedom Land went. That was the land he wanted. He mentioned that in a congressional hearing.
Yeah, Freedom Land, yeah.
And as far as the one in Manhattan, that was too ambitious. It was going to seat 110,000 people and be on stilts, have a TV studio, and have a helipad. It was too ambitious.
Well, I would agree with that, but I'm saying there were options to keep the teams there. Now, the Polo Grounds had a parking lot on 8th Avenue where eventually a school was built. That's why they couldn't get their parking lot there, and so there were options, but they were running across the power broker, Robert Moses, and that's why they really both eventually moved.
Steve,
Can
do you have in your book the photo of the groundbreaking? Just two questions. Do you have the photo of the groundbreaking in the book?
The groundbreaking.
At the one I'm trying to have you tell me who's in that picture, Rob.
The groundbreaking.
sorry.
Groundbreaking at Candlestick. Groundbreaking at
You were
Candlestick.
addressing Steve. I'm very sorry.
Okay. The only one I can identify is Harney. I know we've been going back and forth trying to identify the characters in the groundbreaking. I don't think there's anybody from the New York franchise in that picture, but that's for another time. The second part, Steve, are you aware that the daughter of Mel Ott lives out here in Tucson?
I did not know that.
Very few people know. One of the guys that's on the Zoom here, Rich Rogers, who has a knack for finding these people and finding memorabilia, he introduced me to her. I've had 3 conversations with her. She's going to be 85 next month.
No, she's 85 today, Steve.
Oh, I thought it was November.
No,
85 today?
October 1. I
Okay.
sent her birthday wishes today. I got a message back from her.
She's terrific, and I'm going to try to find out how we can do this, is to get Mel into the Cactus League Hall of Fame. Nobody knows she lives out here, and she's a terrific lady, and she'll talk baseball day and night with you.
Hey,
And,
Steve, sorry,
yes.
didn't mean to interrupt. Steve Treder, I think you should also remind your audience about the urgency of Proposition B, which had a shelf life of December 31st, 1959, which was another urgency that George Christopher, the mayor of San Francisco, was pushing the Bayview property because he had it in his hand. And the corruption that Steve talked about just a few minutes ago is rampant, and it's certainly a part of the story. But keep in mind that with a good team, the Giants drew 1.6 million from 1960 to 1968, despite the fact they were playing in a wind tunnel.
Yes, if Candlestick Park
can I
didn't
be
get
heard?
built, there was
No.
no plan B. There was no alternative but to build Candlestick Park by that point. The money was time limited, as you say, so they had to go with it.
Steve?
Arnie got his way.
Hello. I guess I can't be heard.
Rick Swig, you're on. Go.
Oh, well, thank you. I noticed I have some Landsmen on the phone, the thing today. My grandfather's name was Benjamin Swig. He was a real estate leader in San Francisco. He presented a combination stadium, convention center, and housing project where now the current Moscone Center lies. There was such rampant corruption, and because he was of the Jewish faith, he was excluded from having his proposal offered. I have photos, actually, of a mini of the rendering of that. But there was rampant corruption in San Francisco at that time. The mayor was in cahoots with Harney. They weren't going to let anybody else do this deal, and especially a bunch of Jewish businessmen. But just for your information, and I'll try to find the photo for you, and maybe in my grandfather's book. But it's quite extraordinary. But it was a much better location. Downtown San Francisco would have been perfect.
Out of curiosity, what China Basin in 1957? What was there? Because that's
warehouses.
It was industrial.
Warehouses. Yeah, warehouses. This is a little further in by about, it's 4 blocks from what is now 4 or 5 blocks from what is now the current ballpark site. And the attraction was, because my family was in the hotel business, was that it would be built in conjunction with an arena and convention center, which would have been magnificent. But hindsight is always great sight.
Well,
Rick, your grandfather was also a member of the Board of Trustees of Santa Clara University.
Yes, he was.
There's a big dormitory hall there on the campus which bears his name.
Yes, there is.
It was through your grandfather's influence that the Giants played an exhibition game every spring against the Santa Clara Broncos in Santa Clara, my hometown.
Yep.
I was the bat boy for the Santa Clara Broncos, and believe me, it was the biggest thrill of my entire life to be able to be the bat boy when they played the Giants. It was the best thing ever. Thank your grandfather for me.
Yeah, he's passed.
Lee, Lowenfish?
Yes.
If you ever see the Dirty Harry movies, The Enforcer, they're going over the 3rd Avenue Bridge, and you see where whatever it's called now, Oracle, you see all factories there, and that film was in the early 70s. So, Steve Treder, I have a quick question to you. Despite the haggling and the nonsense with how bad the stadium was, do you feel he was really welcome as a hero, like bringing baseball to California with, nobody was past St. Louis? Why wasn't Stoneham more revered?
Stoneham was publicity shy for his entire life. He knew that he had to be prominent because he was the owner of the Giants, but he never relished that. He never cultivated a public image the way O'Malley did and Veck did. He didn't cultivate relationships with reporters and make sure his story got told. He didn't like all that stuff. He didn't care what the paper said about him. So while the Giants were extremely well received in San Francisco, there were ticker tape parades and the Bay Area went crazy for the Giants. Stoneham stayed in the background. He didn't give interviews. He didn't, get his name in the paper and was happy about that. The big heroes in San Francisco in the early years were not just Willie Mays, but of course Orlando Cepeda and Willie McCovey and Juan Marichal, the players. And Alvin Dark was a big star, but Stoneham, he was his style. He kept out of the press as much as he possibly could. He didn't care about that stuff.
Hey, Steve, this is George Greger. A story I read recently, which may be apocryphal, was that when O'Malley convinced Stoneham they both need to go, he offered Stoneham a choice of Los Angeles or San Francisco, and O'Malley just didn't want to go to San Francisco. But
No,
he
no.
knew that Stoneham would favor the more cosmopolitan city, and that Stoneham believed
No.
LA was just a hick town.
Nope.
San Francisco had the benefits that you described earlier.
As with so much Stoneham lore, that's a myth. That's not true. O'Malley, was pretty sharp with a penny himself, and well understood that as great a market as San Francisco was, and it was a big, booming, growing market in the late 50s, it was dwarfed by Los Angeles. Los Angeles was the best sports market in the world. It was better than New York at that point. O'Malley, there's no way O'Malley was gonna go to San Francisco. O'Malley was gonna go to Los Angeles. O'Malley wanted Stoneham to go to San Francisco with him because that would make the whole thing work out for the best for both of them. But no, that O'Malley would never have offered that deal. Now, that said, it is true that Stoneham liked San Francisco, the downtown style. He liked it. He loved to go to the restaurants there. He loved to spend time in downtown San Francisco. It was a much more Manhattan-like environment than Los Angeles could offer. But that was a secondary consideration. But the reason Stoneham came to San Francisco is because it was a place for him to have a ballpark and make money.
Steve, what was the nastiness of the fans, especially against the Dodgers? Did that start when Stoneham was there, or did that come later?
Oh no, that was almost from the very, very beginning. O'Malley and Stoneham hoped that by coming out together, they would be able to keep their Dodger-Giant rivalry, that had been so fierce in New York. They hoped that it would be able to be rekindled in California. It succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. San Francisco and Los Angeles are themselves rival cities in the state of California, at least more from the point of view of San Franciscans and Los Angeles, but still there was a natural rivalry there that they tapped into, and the fans ate it up from the very beginning. There were rhubarbs and chin music and very, very intense rivalry from the very beginning.
But I actually meant the violence that's happened in the last 20 years. It wasn't that violent when Stoneham was still alive.
Yeah, that really started in the 70s when the economic conditions began to deteriorate in San Francisco, and Candlestick Park really became a really rough destination in the 70s, and then there became a lot of drunkenness and rowdiness in the fans. That had not occurred until the 70s.
Steve, I had a question about Seal Stadium, and the Giants obviously spent 2 years there. I've heard conjecture that there was consideration to double deck that, and that they could have expanded that. It would have been in a better geographic location from the standpoint of the weather. And there were the businesses, all what they were around that could have been obtained, and parking could have been created. There was no parking at Seal Stadium. Can you talk about any consideration to expand Seals or stay in that area?
That was viable. That could have happened. It would have been quite a ambitious project. I mean, the footprint would have needed to be significantly expanded, but Roy Harney wasn't going to make millions of dollars off that.
Okay. Yeah, Harney.
Harney was the guy who drove this. Harney and Christopher, they were in cahoots, as we said, and so there were better options, but Harney's option was going to be the one that was completed.
The other question to follow up on that on Candlestick, I've heard it said that had they just slightly moved the direction of the stadium, the way that it faced, 5-10 degrees, that it would have made a significant difference in terms of how the wind came up in it was late afternoon, let's face it. That's when the wind was there. I've been to a lot of late afternoon games. The wind was terrible then. Have you heard of those studies? Was that true, that a slight ambience?
That was speculated, but they thought then that when the ballpark was completely enclosed, when the 49ers came there in 1970, 71, they thought that would serve the purpose of being the windbreak they would stop the wind. It didn't help. It helped only nominally. No, it was the location that was the problem. The wind, there were two problems with the candlestick location. Well, there were many problems, but among the two was the wind, which was a problem no matter how the stadium was configured, unless it was domed, and the cold weather at night. At night, it became damp and cold in the summertime, just brutally cold, miserably cold. That was going to be a problem no matter what. They thought that they would resolve that with radiant heating. Candlestick Park was radiant heating, at least the lower deck was radiant heating. But whoever the contractor was, Roy Harney, and he botched the construction of it such that the radiant heating didn't work. So it was just a miserable, cold, terrible place to watch.
But it was still better in the day. I went to many day games. I didn't like going to night games there, but the day games.
Until about 3 o'clock, it was
on a day game.
Until about 3 o'clock, it was usually very nice.
Yeah.
Let me talk about the situation at the stadium. I mentioned before there was a park across the street on 16th Street. Stoneham wanted that for 12,000 parking spaces. Heirs of the land, it was dedicated as a park. So Stoneham couldn't get its parking spaces. Now, as far as Moscone Center, it was all the department stores that lobbied against building at Moscone Center because that would take away from the parking for the people that wanted to shop at the department store. Now, let me go back to Horace Stoneham. I believe that Horace was not very shy. Horace was a drinker, and he used to entertain at the Leopard Club on Montgomery Street so he could show off to all the sports reporters. Now, when you talk about Willie Mays was booed in his first 2 years, even though he batted .347, because there were still fans that loved Joe DiMaggio. And even though he only had 29 home runs, he was booed. So Herb Cain said, San Francisco, a town that cheers the Syracuse chef, which they did at the ball top, but boos Willie Mays.
As with so much, that story is told far beyond its truth. San Francisco fans loved Willie Mays. Everybody loved Willie Mays, especially the teams he played for. The fans loved Willie Mays. They loved Orlando Cepeda at least as much because Cepeda was their discovery. But they loved Mays. And, you know, sure, some loudmouth fan will boo anybody, but San Francisco fans in general never, ever booed Willie Mays. Herb Cain would write a clever column, but it's not the case that the San Francisco fans were anything except ecstatic they had Willie Mays at disposal.
Mars, I would say
he was an icon in the Bay Area, and when Stoneham was forced to trade him away in 1972, the Bay Area was stunned. It was a terrible thing to have to lose Willie Mays.
Mars, I'd say that the love of Mays grew measurably through the years. It somewhat lukewarm, maybe a bit in 58 and 59 when they had Cepeda and McCovey stealing a lot of the show there and a lot of the interest. But Mays became his actions on and off the field made him a fan's favorite. The further into his career that he got, it grew. It really grew there. They had to get to know him, and when they did, they loved him more, I think, than Mays. Than Cepeda or McCovey.
Steve Treder, if I could jump in here just for a moment to say that part of the reason that you're pointing out here about Mays, the reception that he got from the press initially was that they were promoting a new kind of ball club. They wanted to revise, they wanted to ditch all New York association, and Mays was the only superstar that came west. And one of the things they didn't deny his greatness. They simply promoted those that never wore a New York Giants jersey. They wanted to home grow their stars. And the first one was Cepeda, the second one was McCovey. Now, by 1960, all the journalists were on board, of course. How could they deny Mays' greatness? They couldn't. And he truly grew into a great San Francisco icon. But that initial 58, 59 business was a lot to do with the sports writers like Curly Grieve and others who wanted to promote the West Coast type player and wanted to dissociate the history and have their own Giants team become a San Francisco team.
Well, before there was Cepeda and McCovey, there's a guy named Joe DiMaggio. He may have to fight that off too.
Dan, you want to speak, Dan?
Steve, I'd like to ask you a question about the demographics of the 1950s Giants. You mentioned, and it's been widely reported, that the reason the Giants moved is because they needed more parking. There's no parking in New York City. The neighborhood's deteriorating around the greater Harlem area. Now, how did Horace Stoneham really come to that conclusion? Was it more of just like a eyeball gut sense type of thing, or did he do any kind of marketing survey research to try to determine that? And if so, what was done? And has there ever been any kind of demographic work done on the number of, say, black fans that were attending games in the 50s, given that there were a black community so close to the ballpark?
Remember, or let's bear in mind that Major League Baseball was not the only industry being affected by the great economic and demographic changes in the 50s. Lots of businesses were suffering downtown, department stores and manufacturing firms. And, a lot of companies were reconsidering where they located their operations, and they were thinking about relocating to better pastures in the West and the South. And so there's lots of market research being done on it could be called fan bases in baseball. There'd be customer bases for lots of businesses, and there were just more affluent markets outside of the older inner cities. And as much as Stoneham loved the fact that the black fans from Harlem, came to watch, Mays and Hank Thompson and Bill White play for the Giants, there weren't as many of them as there were white fans, and they weren't as affluent. They weren't as able to afford to buy as many tickets. No, the business case was just a no-brainer that not only baseball but lots of businesses were going to have a much brighter future in a market like the Bay Area than the market as it existed at that time. In the inner city in New York. Now that would obviously change in coming decades, but we look back at the 1950s as this golden age in baseball, and on the field, of course, it was. It was not a golden age economically. It was a lot of hard times, and they needed to do something. If Stoneham and O'Malley had not moved, they were in for a rough economic ride for at least 10, 15 years, 20 years perhaps, until sort of the cycle began to turn. And that's assuming they got new ballparks, which there was, until Shea Stadium was built, there was no new ballpark for them either. So it was not a tough call for Stoneham to figure out that he was going to make more money in San Francisco.
Have you ever come across anything that would indicate the percentage of black fans would attend a game at that time, roughly? Like 10%, 20%, 50%, anything?
I'm sure they looked at it in the Polo Grounds in the 1950s. It was probably quite a bit more than 10%, but it was 10% of a shrinking pie. The Giants were only drawing 600,000 fans a year in 56 and 57. They were not profitable, and so they weren't gonna get out of that by attracting more black fans. That was not a long-term strategy.
But O'Malley was making. When you drew 1 million people in 1957, you were making money. When O'Malley noticed there were too many black fans coming into the ballpark, he was a racist, and he didn't like that. He wanted a new ballpark. So again, with Robert Moses, he wanted where the bar is now, on the waterfront. Moses turned them down. O'Malley was making money. $1 million when you draw $1 million.
As much money as the Milwaukee Braves were making. There was more money to be made than O'Malley was making.
Oh yeah, and now
get richer than he could get richer in Los Angeles than he could in Brooklyn. That's why he went.
Well, then Blake,
I saw one estimate that when Jackie Robinson broke in 1947, it was not a capacity crowd for opening day, and half the crowd was black.
Power on.
They did break a record that year in 47, but it was only about 10,000 more in 46 when everyone did well, and then it went down. And sports writers have told me that the die was cast certainly when O'Malley moved those games to Jersey City after the 55 World Championship. that was 1/600th of the way to L.A. John Lardner wrote, and sure enough, that's what's happened. And O'Malley was showing letters to sports writers in '55 that season's ticket holders don't want to come to Ebbets Field because it was getting too dangerous, or which means they didn't like being surrounded by too many people of color. To get back to Stoneham for a second, how involved was he in the trades that he made? Like the one of Stanky and Dark was a great trade, and I know DeRocher wanted it, but was he involved in that trade and other trades?
Thank you for bringing that up. Once Bill Terry resigned in 1942, Stoneham never hired another general manager, ever. He was the general manager. Stoneham negotiated every trade. He negotiated the Stanky Dark trade. He negotiated all the trades. He would have help. Chub Feeney was an advisor to him, and he would take input from DeRocher or whoever his manager was. He collaborated in the decision making. He wasn't a loner in that sense, but he was the final decision maker of every trade, every call up, every waiver deal. He was the general manager of the Giants from 1942 to 1975.
He orchestrated the Bobby Thompson trade for Johnny Antonelli?
Absolutely, yes.
Steve, it's getting late. A couple of things. When should we expect the arrival of the book?
I am currently in the copy editing and proofreading phase, which, as Rob well knows, is a little bit hectic. But once that's done at the end of this month, then it will go to the printer. And I don't know exactly when, but my understanding is the book will be published in early 2021. They try to get baseball books out in time for spring training because that's when baseball books sell. In the time of COVID, who knows how valid that's going to be, but that's my understanding.
And
spring. And I'll be happy to come back and talk with you.
Yeah, we would love for you to come back. I mean, I'd like a couple of people to ask some more questions who have not spoken. But getting back to, Rob Garrett's going to be on here, and Jamie, do you feel in your mind that if he gets on this Hall of Fame ballot that he is deserving of enshrinement?
If
Is that a question to me?
Tom Yawkey deserves the Hall of Fame, then Stoneham deserves it 10 times over.
Absolutely, yeah.
Stoneham was among the most impactful, progressive. He was impactful in the westward migration, in the racial integration. He was a general manager as well as an owner. He was a huge figure for 40 years. He absolutely deserves it.
Why aren't San Francisco writers doing anything to publicize this?
Because Stoneham was the world's worst self-promoter. He never talked to the press. He never cultivated his own reputation. He never talked about himself. He shied publicity. Nobody knew him, and he was happy with that. And so he never got a coterie of supporters in the media the way other owners like O'Malley and Beck did.
But you okay for a few more questions?
Yeah.
Steve, you all right for a few more questions?
Yes. Steve, you'd mentioned earlier that fans were unhappy that Mays got traded in '72. What were the reasons behind that? Were they all financial? Were there any other reason behind Mays getting
financial?
traded?
It was financial. Mays at that point was nearing the end of his playing career and needed financial security. So he wanted a long-term deal that would pay him as a coach for like 10 years after he retired. And Stoneham couldn't afford that. He couldn't afford it. And so the only way he could ensure Mays's financial security was to allow Joan Payson to acquire him, because Joan Payson wanted Mays and had the wherewithal to keep Mays secure. So it was entirely financial. Stoneham hated to do it because he adored Mays. And of course the Bay Area was just bereft at losing Mays. It was just very, very sad time.
And how did Mays feel about this whole thing going on about coming to the Mets?
Stoneham negotiated the entire thing without even telling Mays. Mays heard about it through the press, which was horrible. I mean, Stoneham deserves credit for thinking of Mays' future and doing the right thing for Mays, but he deserves scorn for keeping it a secret from Mays. He treated Mays like a child. Mays was 41 years old and deserved to be treated with respect like an adult, and Stoneham didn't do it. Mays, wasn't displeased with the idea of going back to New York. He loved New York. He knew that the fans loved him back there. He knew that he liked the Paysons, and he figured that he would be well treated in New York. But his preference certainly wouldn't have been that. He wanted to stay in San Francisco. He wanted to be the icon in San Francisco that he eventually, was when he moved back to San Francisco in later years. But no, Mays was hurt and humiliated that Stoneham had done all this behind his back. But as Mays always did, he didn't complain in public, and he put on a brave face for the public.
And how ironic was it to hit the home run when the first game with the Mets, he hit the home run against the Giants? How ironic was
First
that?
home run of the year. And then when they came to Candlestick Park, his first game as a Met against the Giants, I was at that game. He hit another home run. He was magic. Mays was.
Yeah, I was at the game where he hit the home run for the Mets. The first game.
Think about Horace Stoneham. When you talk about orchestrating the trade for Eddie Stanky and Alvin Dark, that was totally Leo DeRocher, because he playing for the Gas House gang. DeRocher was going for defense, speed, not so much power. Because don't forget, in 1947, the Giants and the Reds, they had a record for most home runs in the National League. And those guys were clods. You'd have these single home runs with nobody on base, and they were losers. So it was DeRocher's idea. It was DeRocher's idea to rebuild the team along the lines of a pitching and defense team. But DeRocher was not the general manager. DeRocher didn't have the authority to negotiate a trade. That trade was negotiated between Stoneham and John Quinn of the Braves. But DeRocher, being a baseball man, not Stoneham, had the influence. DeRocher worked for Stoneham, not the other way around. It was Stoneham's call. It was Stoneham's ball club. But we're talking about baseball men that know a lot more than Donor.
I'll get off in 5 minutes. We don't want to eat?
No, I can wait.
10 minutes.
Steve,
Yeah, 10 minutes.
After Stoneham let DeRocher go in 1955, did they have any relationship at all afterwards?
No, the Stoneham-DeRocher relationship began to deteriorate in the early 50s, and it really, really fell apart in the fall and winter of 1954-55. After the Giants won the World Series, DeRocher, of course, hung around with his showbiz pals and made fun of Stoneham behind his back. There was an infamous stag party in New York in the winter of '55, in which Danny Kaye, one of DeRocher's buddies, impersonates a drunken Stoneham at this raucous stag party, and not only impersonates a drunken Stoneham, but, excuse my French here, pulls out his pecker and puts it on a plate and walks around as a drunken Horace Stoneham, making a complete fool of Stoneham. Well, of course, it broke the place up. Everybody laughed out loud, but DeRocher had to know this was going to get back to Stoneham, and of course it did. Everybody heard about it in baseball. Stoneham was terribly humiliated, furious with DeRocher that he would allow his buddies to make fun of Stoneham this way. And from that point forward, DeRocher's goose was cooked. He phoned it in the 1955 season, but it was obvious that he was not going to be rehired at the end of the season. And at the day the season ended and his contract expired, Stoneham let him go. They were never on speaking terms after that.
And when Al Dark made those comments about the black and Latin players not trying as hard, Stoneham didn't fire him immediately. And I for one, words, sticks and stones may break my bones. I'm from that school, but he ultimately did replace Dark. Did you get into the process he went through in that whole period?
The version of it that I believe and that I tell in the book is that when those Dark remarks were published in Newsday magazine in the summer of '64, that Stoneham was furious with Dark and wanted to fire him immediately, and was talked out of firing him immediately by Chub Feeney by Herman Franks and by Willie Mays. And their reasoning, especially Mays's reasoning, was that to fire Dark immediately at that moment would make Dark a martyr, a hero among the segregationists and the resistors of the civil rights movement, and that they didn't want to give Dark that status. And so what they persuaded Stoneham to do was let it play out, let him continue to manage until the end of the season. And then after supposedly the fire had died down a little bit, and then fire Dark, and that's what he did. Stoneham was, like I say, he was not a racial crusader by any means, but he was offended by Dark's comments, and he was offended that Dark would say such things about Cepeda in particular, and Dark's relationship with Stoneham fell apart at that point as well. I believe in later years they had a rapprochement, but at that point Stoneham was done with Dark.
Well, the Empire brought in more black players than Branch and Rickey. So the Giants were really forerunners of integration in baseball. Of course, with the Yankees and Red Sox being the last to get on board with that. But Steve, I really believe way much credit. There are people today that are still sitting on his grave for taking the Giants out of there. And O'Malley was strictly a businessman, but much more astute than Stoneham.
The evidence does not support that. Stoneham was a businessman too. In fact, the Giants were his only business. If the Giants didn't make money, the Stoneham family was going to be in trouble. Stoneham was a sharp business operator and knew exactly what the trade-off was. And the fact is he was going to make more money in San Francisco than remaining in New York. So that's why he did it. Stoneham loved New York. Stoneham loved the Polo Grounds. Stoneham did not want to go, but it was a smart business move, and so that's why he did it.
Well, just to end my part of the conversation, I went to the last Giant Dodger game played in the Polo Grounds. We were sitting in the upper right field stands, just in foul territory. Jim Gilliam hit a ball right off my pop's fingertips, and the next pitch was a home run with Drysdale on base. Dodgers took a 2-0. Mason Jablonski tripled in the fourth inning, and Hank Sauer hit a 2-run homer in the fourth. That stood up, and the Giants won 3-2. So I've been going to ball games since 1947, and to me, Horace Stoneham was the culprit. He has everybody else, they have positive things about him, but I don't believe he was an astute businessman at all, and he was a drunk.
You're entitled to your opinion.
Have you done the research?
Everyone's entitled to their opinion, but don't really agree with that one. Nope.
And
What a
also,
great
you're
job!
arguing with
What a
the man
great
who
job
did
of
the
research you did, Steve. Amazing.
Steve, for a guy who only is a San Francisco fan, you are a round of applause. I think it's fabulous.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
We can't thank you enough for joining us tonight, Steve. Rob Garrett, you're on deck in 2 weeks.
Yeah, I'll be there.
So we look forward to you. And like I said, we have a lot of other meetings. Right now, the A's won. So as of this moment, there'll be no meeting next week, as I had hoped. Something might change. If it does, I will, of course, email you guys. But a great turnout tonight. We had 37 people. So
Gary, could you ask Rob and Steve to give us a weather report? How is the air and the health situation where they are?
Gentlemen,
Thank you, Lee. In the Bay Area, the big fire that's still burning is up in Napa, Sonoma counties, and it is blowing the smoke. Depending on the direction of the wind, the last 2 days it's been blowing smoke into the San Francisco Bay Area. The air quality is unhealthy. It's miserably hot, and it's not pleasant at all. It's the worst fire season in history.
I can report to you from Whidbey Island that we are being told that we're going to get the California smoke. It's supposed to be arriving within a day or two, but right now today is quite clear.
Yeah, to add to that, if you can hear me, I have a home in Napa, which unfortunately got burned last night, or Monday night. Today, the winds are going to be 40 miles an hour. Tonight, the winds go to 40 miles an hour. It's 105 degrees today, and 90,000 acres are burned, and the disaster is yet to begin. That's how bad it is.
So sorry to hear that, Rick.
Yeah.
You guys make it out okay.
Yeah. Well, my body got safe. My body's safe. That's good.
And there are ads all over my car in Pacific Heights in San Francisco and on my property in Mendocino County. A few weeks ago, there was a fire right across the creek from me, and it's been contained, but there's fires all over North California, and it's the worst disaster ever. And, I think we're in for, I hate to be pessimistic, but global warming has taken a huge effect.
Yep.
Thank God for baseball and baseball history.
Yes.
Thank you, Lee. You're right.
Well,
Thank you for making me feel better today.
I think this is a great form of entertainment that we're trying to do here. And it's very, very, we lost all the live meetings. I think this is a more than suitable replacement. I actually think many of you prefer this. So onward, and we're going to move forward this.
Thank you.
No, thank you guys, because without you guys coming here, it'd be me. So. Anyway,
Nobody has to travel to this meeting.
Yeah, exactly. It's great getting people who don't just live in New York, that we are able to branch out like this. So it's really a wonderful thing. Anyway, we'll wrap it up here. Steve, again, marvelous. We can't wait for your book to come out. So
thank you.
Good luck with all of that. And you
Steve, who's the publisher? Steve, who's
University
the
of Nebraska. University of Nebraska Press.
University of Nebraska. Okay, thank you.
And we'll all see you guys in 2 weeks, unless something comes up and I contact you in the following week. Okay.
All right.
Thanks, Gary.
Everybody stay healthy. Be well.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.